As the 19th century was drawing to a close, Victorians were offered a glimpse of an unknown world. The new technology was the beginning of an entertainment revolution, one which would transport its onlookers from a mundane existence to a celluloid dream of excitement, romance and adventure. This film celebrates a century of Bristol cinema, from silence to talkies, from flea pits to picture palaces, from boom to decline, and unexpectedly back to boom. As many as 70 cinemas in the city over a century. No one person can claim to have invented moving pictures alone, but there is strong evidence to support the local contribution to the invention of both photography and film.
The house you see over my right-hand shoulder is Laycock Abbey, and it's the home of the Talbot family. The most well-known of the Talbots was William Henry Fox Talbot, who was born in 1877. And he's known as the inventor or discoverer of the positive-negative photographic process. He made his first negative in 1835, and this was of a small window which is on the south facade of Laycock Abbey behind me. And with this image began the whole of photography. The progression from static images to moving images didn't in fact happen overnight. You progress from a glass plate to celluloid, and then from that you got a roll of film.
The creation of moving film was also the dream of Bristol-born inventor William Freeze Green. Freeze Green claims to have shown moving pictures at a Royal Photographic meeting in 1885 and patented his invention in 1899.
He was far too free with knowledge and his patents. He gave a lot of information away, and that was really his downfall.
Controversy still surrounds the extent of Freeze Green's claim. The first public films shown in England were produced by the French inventors brothers Louis and Auguste Lumière. They were shown in 1896 at Regent Street, Polly, London. At a music hall in Broadmead, Bristolians were thrilled at their first sight of moving film. Apart from fairgrounds and sideshows, the Tivoli Theatre is said to have been the first Bristolian venue to show films. Jerky images and very brief sequences, but nonetheless a marvel to those who'd never seen anything like it before. The new invention was featured for just 2 weeks before the Tivoli reverted to its usual programme of variety, but this was a new beginning, not an ending. As early as 1901, thousands of Bristolians came to the Colston Hall to watch novelty films put on by Thomas Edison. 12 years later, the first cinema in Bristol was established, completing the transition of film from an inventor's dream to a commercial reality. The Bio-Cinema, named after the bioscope, opened in 1908 in Counterslip Hall, Temple Street. For the princely sum of twopence, up to 600 patrons were treated to a film programme of entertainment and a cup of tea and a biscuit during the interval. The Bio only lasted for 10 years, perhaps partly due to its notoriously uncomfortable seating, and was later replaced by George's Brewery. On the corner of Merchant Street and Broad Weir, the Gem opened in 1909, catering for 1,200. Patrons had to climb a ladder to reach the balcony. Fumigation with sprays was a regular occurrence. With its bottom-numbing stone slab seats, the Gem was one of Bristol's worst flea pits. One of the last cinemas to change to talkies, it closed in 1932 when it was used for boxing. In 1909, another existing venue to cash in on the cinema bug was the Vestry Hall in Pennywell Road. The Vestry's projection system didn't reach the whole length of the hall, so the screen was put partway back. Those looking for a bargain could sit behind the screen for a halfpenny instead of the usual penny. However, this had the disadvantage in the silent days of having to read the captions backwards. Music was provided by a pianist. Built in 1880, by the time it was forced to close, it was very out of date. Local cinema buff Wally Ball recalls one of the difficulties of those early days.
Now, in those days, a lot of the older people, could not read. And there was always a murmur of voices in the audience of someone reading the subtitles on the screen.
It was all part of the atmosphere peculiar to the silence. Yet another cinema to open in 1909 was His Majesty's in Stapleton Road, Eastville. Its 800-seat capacity was expanded to 1,150 when a balcony was added, prior to reopening on Boxing Day in 1911. Many years later, in 1969, affected by the decline in cinema going, the stalls were converted to a bingo hall. The upstairs, however, survived as a more modest 330-seat cinema and was rechristened the Concord. Despite later dividing the upstairs into two screens, the Concord finally ground to a halt in 1990. The new decade brought with it a continued increase in the number of venues. Instead of converting an existing building, the 385-seater Queen's Hall in Peter Street was the first purpose-built cinema in central Bristol. In those days, smoking was still a part of the cinema experience. The Queen's catered for this by incorporating a sliding roof into its design. The roof took a long time to slide over, so if it started to rain suddenly, the audience got wet. Ralph Pringle was responsible for opening several local cinemas. He knocked down 2 houses and 3 shops and built a 1,400-seat cinema in the same year as the Queen's. The flamboyant building in Zetland Road had an obvious theatrical influence. Known originally as Pringle's Picture Palace, then the Zetland and finally the Scala, it survived right up until 1974. The building was eventually demolished and blocks of flats now occupy the site. In 1910, Pringle also opened the Dolphin, named after Dolphin Street in the central shopping area. A conversion from shops, the Dolphin was a smaller affair than the Scala. It only had 500 seats. The film used in those early days was highly flammable and safety measures were fairly limited. One Saturday night, a fire in the rewind room spread to the pay box. The Dolphin's short history ended in 1922. Wally Ball remembers the hazard of flammable film.
I was 15 years of age and I was working at the Metropole Cinema in Ashley Road. I was in the rewind room, rewinding the film back that had just come off the projector, when suddenly there was a clatter in the projection room. And I rushed in, and what it was, the film had caught fire, it had broken in the gate of the projector. The operator was tearing the film away, and it was on the floor in flames, and I chased in, and I stamped on it, and I put the flames out. Well, that was my experience after a fortnight working in a cinema. But later in the afternoon, I was called down in the office, and the manager praised me for my action. He said, "I'm going to give you an increase in your wages." And so I was waiting for the Friday. This was on the Monday. I was waiting for this increase. And on the Friday, when I had my wage packet, I had an increase of 6pence, which in pence today, you know what that would be.
Roller skating had been all the rage, but as the public transferred its attention to cinema, venue owners were persuaded to follow suit. The Olympia in Carey's Lane, which had been a skating rink, opened as a cinema in 1910. It showed news, cartoons and shorts. In 1947 it became known as the Tatler, a continental cinema. It was notorious locally for showing X-rated films. Another local cinema which opened in 1915 was the Hotwells. It had seating for around 400 and its patrons were from Clifton Wood and the old dockside areas. It's believed to have closed during the war. A number of rather surprising venues have played host to film at some point in their history. A portion of the Victoria Rooms became the Clifton Super Cinema between 1919 and 1922. A short-lived venture, it was plagued with problems over the licence and the nameplate outside. 10 years after the Victoria Rooms switched off its projectors for the last time, the Bristol Hippodrome took over the role. The Hippodrome had been Bristol's premier theatre, and its change of use left the city without a specialist variety house. After conversion, it reopened with a lavish interior and an orchestra space converted to a garden, complete with a lily pond. Six years later, in 1938, the popular venue returned to variety, and as such is still successful today. Perhaps the most surprising venue to show films was Bristol North Baths. During the cold winter season, when swimming wasn't viable, it was converted to a cinema by fitting boards over the pool. During the warmer summer months, it reverted to a public baths. By the mid-30s, its life as a cinema ended when it began to offer swimming facilities all year round. The distinctive Victorian building remains a swimming bath to this day. In those silent days, the pictures were brought to life with music and sound effects. Pianists accompanied the action in many cinemas. Some larger venues, such as the Gaumont and the King's, employed a small orchestra.
The orchestras in the cinema, they used to play accordingly to what the film was showing. For instance, if anybody was dying or somebody was in trouble, there would be quiet music played on the piano or something like that, you know. Or if it was a war scene, then the drums would be played and all that. Now, some cinemas didn't have orchestras. All they had was a pianist in the small suburb cinemas, and therefore the pianist had to play according to the scenes that appeared on the screen.
The premiere at Gloucester Road was famed for its use of sound effects. Ben-Hur was brought to life with chains dragged across the floor. At one particularly enthusiastic showing of 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse, fireworks were set off representing battle scenes. The resulting smoke was so thick it is said that the audience almost suffocated and the auditorium had to be cleared. The premiere seated 600 and 100 in the balcony. In 1964, a victim of the decline, it was sold to a building company for £26,000. It's now a Summerfield supermarket.
I started going to the cinema when I was a child, about 5 or 6, you know. It was in the district of Redfield, and it was the Globe Cinema at Lawrence Hill. We had to throw a penny into the fire bucket. It was only 1 penny to go in on a Saturday morning. But, you know, the children, they were as artful in those days as they are today. I can see Mrs. Brain now. In those days, they wore long clothes down to the floor, stood by the door to go into the cinema. And as long as she heard the sound of metal go into the bucket, she would let us go through. Well, what happened? We would get into the scrapyard, it was nearby, and get these washers and throw washers in. And therefore, the penny in the bucket didn't last very long because there were more washers in that bucket, you know, than pennies. But when you come to think of it, you know, we were not robbing the proprietor of the cinema because the scrapyard belonged to the same person, a Mr. Pugsley, who owned the scrapyard and the cinema.
So, what was the fascination which kept these children coming back to queue up every Saturday morning outside their local cinema? The predecessor to the modern soap opera, perhaps?
They used to show what they called serials. That was a film that would be shown about 20 minutes, and it would follow on the following week. And there was one called The Hooded Terror. And there was one particular one called The Perils of Pauline, with the star's name was Pearl White. And I always remember those films very well as a child. They made a big impression on the children, you know. Pearl White, at the end of that particular session, she would be tied to the railway track. And the train would be thundering along, and then suddenly it would say to be continued next week. And us children would be biting our nails, you know, waiting for next week to come. And therefore, the next week, the film was shown, but she never got run over. I know on one occasion, she was being lowered into a big vat of boiling oil. She was wriggling around, and as she was being lowered into the vat, it said to be continued next week. And therefore we had to save our money, you know, to go the following week. It was just a sprat to catch a mackerel. And that's how the serials were shown, to catch the children to come the following, and the grown-ups as well, because the grown-ups enjoyed those serials as much as the children.
At the heart of a community, the Globe didn't restrict its output to films.
Well, before the war, there was no Sunday cinemas, and the Globe used to be used, and they used to have concerts on a Sunday night.
Did they?
Free of charge, because they weren't allowed to charge, like, see?
Right, I see.
And they would have concerts on Sunday nights, and local people would do their little acts, you know.
As well as a traditional programme, the Globe experimented with 3D films as early as the 1920s.
They would let you have a pair of glasses, you know, cardboard glasses, but in the lens were a green and a red lens. And when you put them on, the whole film was in 3D, and that was 1927.
Good Lord. The much missed Globe Picture Theatre, Lawrence Hill. But what a very imposing building that was.
When the Globe was modernised, it lost a great deal of its charm, but it still survived as a cinema until 1973. It was eventually pulled down. Today, a car showroom occupies the site. The Globe was always very popular with children, who, like thousands of others around the country, were fascinated by the magical adventures on screen. A few of those youngsters were too enterprising to just sit back and watch their heroes.
As a boy, I was always interested in photography and cinematography, and we used to have a shed at the side of the house, which we converted, or my brother and myself, we converted into a cinema and a small theatre. Well, in those days we had a magic lantern. We used to be able to buy the magic lanterns and buy the reels of film, the 35mm film of old newsreels and things like that, scrap pieces from the rolls that they showed in the cinema, and we used to show them in the shed there, and we had curtains and I had a screen that poured on a rope that used to come down behind the curtain to show the films on. And we probably remember the saying, for 2 pins I would do so. So that's what we used to charge, 2 pins to be able to come in to see the films there. We didn't realise at the time that these films were very flammable, and we used to use oil lamps in the first instance to illuminate the film and to wind the film down, and no reels at the bottom. We used to drop into a cardboard box underneath, and Lord knows what would have happened if that caught fire, because they were very flammable. Anyway, we went from there. I did manage to fix up an electric lamp in the back of it in the end, and we used to do that and give shows and in that shed there that we had fixed up for a cinema.
Luxury was at a premium at the Clair Street Cinema. Its entrance between Clair Street and Colston Avenue led to a pretty cafe, a favourite haunt of Clifton ladies. Page boys in shiny shoes and white gloves stood by in attendance to take hats and coats as patrons filled the 470 seats. Ladies did not need to remove their hats, as the seating was specially arranged to accommodate them. Reading lights were incorporated to enable clients to read their programmes. Footage of the coronation of King George V was sent down to Bristol by train and screened on the actual day of the event. John Duggan, a former projectionist, referred to the Clair Street venue as the picture-goer's idea of perfection. Yet it only lasted 16 years, and in 1927 was deemed too small to survive. In fact, the 20s saw a spate of cinema closures due to licensing problems or simply because they didn't pay. Some of them were not purpose-built, but had tried showing films just for a short while. Amongst the sad ruins of Clifton Spa, the former glory of the building is evident. Fishpond's Picture House operated between 1911 and 1922. The building still survives, and now, used as a library, is still close to the heart of the community. The uniquely shaped Colosseum showed films between 1912 and 1924. The 470-seat venue had previously been a roller skating rink and an exhibition hall. A small fashionable 1920s rendezvous featuring a ladies' orchestra, it closed because it didn't pay. The Castle Street Cinema Theatre showed films between 1911 and 1926. For these venues, the 20s were the end of an era, but just around the corner was an exciting new development which would revolutionise the industry.
Now, this is one of the projectors used in the cinema in the 30s. Now, prior to this projector, the sound used to be on a disc or on a record, and that was a turntable at the rear of the machine. It ran at 33 1/3 per minute, and the film ran about 90 foot per minute, and they were synchronized together. But in 1929, the talkies came to Bristol, and that was at the King's Cinema in Old Market. And the reason why is because in Castle Street a super cinema opened called the Regent, and all the trade started going to the Regent because it was a super cinema. Well, this affected the Kings, but they wired the cinema with sound. They took a gamble, actually, because the talkies were in their infancy, and people said they would not last. So they took this gamble, and it proved a success. The film they showed was The Singing Fool with Al Jolson, and they showed 4 shows a day for 6 weeks, and people from all around Bristol and outside of Bristol flocked into Bristol to the King's Cinema to see talking films. It was new, people talking from the screen. It was marvellous.
The first sound films that came into Bristol was in the King's Cinema in Old Market Street, and halfway through the film it used to go out of sync, and they used to go back and try and catch it up and start all over again.
The King's was to continue as one of Bristol's most popular venues for many years. In its later history, it fought off the threat of closure by showing X-rated films. Eventually it closed in 1976, was demolished and replaced with an office development. A large central cinema like the King's was bound to invest in the new audio technology, but owners of small suburban picture houses were faced with a dilemma. For small out-of-town cinemas, the financial risk was considerable. The Eastville Hippodrome had opened back in 1913 with only 300 seats.
In 1930, I showed the first talkie film in the suburbs, and that was at the Eastville Hippodrome. The proprietor of the cinema where I worked, Mr. Allen, he owned His Majesty's, the Metropole, and the Eastville Hippodrome. And the Eastville Hippodrome was the smallest of his cinemas. So shortly after the King's, he wired the Eastville Hippodrome with sound. And the sound was on a record. You had to synchronize the film with the record. I remember showing the film called The Broadway Melody with Bessie Love and Charles King. And in that film they sang that song, You Were Meant for Me. In a very short time, it done so well that the Metropole and His Majesty's turned over to talkies. And within the 12 months of the King's Cinema going to talkies, every cinema in Bristol was wired for sound.
The Eastville Hippodrome was a popular local cinema which lasted up until 1959, when it changed over to a car showroom. The building still remains. The Magnet in Newfoundland Road, which had opened in 1914 with 520 seats, was another small local cinema. It made the change to talkies, but only survived until 1937. The exterior of the building still retains its distinctive front. One of the first cinemas specially designed for talkies was the Savoy at Shirehampton. It opened in 1933 and was affectionately known as the Cabbage. After the war, the latest technology, a 35-feet CinemaScope screen, was installed. It continued showing films until 1962, when it became one of the many cinemas to convert to a bingo hall. The Empire had opened as a variety theatre back in 1893, part of the busy Old Market shopping centre. As the early days of sound were capturing the imagination of the public, it gave up variety to become a cinema. The large building in Carey's Lane was entered through the White Hart Inn public house in Old Market Street. The attendants were always well presented and inspected by the management prior to opening each day. By 1939, the Empire had gone back to being a variety theatre. Films with sound became mainstream, and in the 1930s, the Queen's Cinema was reborn as the News Theatre, showing current events in the form of newsreels.
The Bristol News Theatre came into being in the 1933 period, and it finished in 1956. It was located at the top of Castle Street. Today that will be opposite the ruin of St Peter's Church. It was a raked, stalls-only cinema, and for £1 you would have an hour programme which consisted of films 3 newsreels, Movie Tone, Gaumont British, the extended, move on to Clair Journal, which was the French newsreel in English, a 2-reel comedy such as Laurel and Hardy, and of course single reels such as Pete Smith's speciality, Joe McDoke's comedy. The place itself was quite unique. It would always conclude the programme with one of the Republic chapter plays, but it would always start the programme with God Save the King, later God Save the Queen, and the reason being it wouldn't be shown again until the end because the programmes were continuous. The only break when the lights went up, when the ice cream girl came down to the front to sell the soft drinks, the chocolates, but not the cigarettes.
The early days of cinemas, of course, they were all owned by families, not only in Bristol but throughout the country. They were mainly private families. Some of them had just taken cinemas as a hobby, not necessarily as their main business, but as time went on and cinemas became more profitable, then the families bought more cinemas and enlarged them. From those small groups grew the bigger groups. My family became involved in the cinema business when my father, during the First World War, was an electrician and started off as a sort of part-time projectionist electrician in Southampton. He got bitten by the cinema bug and he heard of the Town Hall Cinema in Bristol was going to be auctioned for sale. Came up to Bristol. Unfortunately, he was a little bit too late for that one, but he moved into the sale of the Null Picture House in Totterdown in Null. The firm there had gone bankrupt, so he was able to make a reasonably good offer for it and started off there, and that was in 1918. Initially at the Null Picture House, times were pretty hard, I suppose, because, as I say, the original firm that ran it had gone bankrupt. But he opened a billiard saloon above the foyer of the cinema, which was popular with the young men of the area at the time. And I suppose they used to come in and play billiards as opposed to snooker, which one plays today, and then go on to the cinema afterwards. They used to serve teas and various other things which helped to make it pay. He also bought the shop next door, which was a sweet shop, so people were buying their sweets and chocolates there as well. From there onwards, he always wanted to build a cinema of his own, design it himself. He wanted to do the electrical work himself as well. So in 1933, he opened the Gaiety Cinema at about a mile and a half further up the road from the Null Picture House. And from there, in 1938, he went further on and designed and built the Broadway Cinema in the newly established Filwood Estate. Each cinema got bigger. The Null Picture House was 600 seats, the Gaiety Cinema had 800 seats, and the Broadway Cinema had 1,200 seats. From that point onwards, the cinema itself were very popular. Audiences were queued up almost every night of the week, and there was no problems in making the cinemas pay. He was a good businessman in his way, and really from very small beginnings became quite successful.
The family cinema business was long-lived and successful. However, eventually television proved to be too strong competition for both the Null Picture House and the Broadway. Closed in 1961, the Null was demolished and the Broadway went over to bingo. At its peak, every main road into town had its own cinema. Suburban cinemas were essential, as car ownership was limited, so many cinema goers became loyal to their own local. The South Bristol area is a great example of this. The Town Hall in Cannon Street was used as a cinema from 1909. Some unlucky patrons had their view obscured by the balcony pillars. It was very out of date at its closure in 1954, and the ornate building was demolished to make way for modern shops. Down the road in East Street was the Picturedrome, or Penny Pops as it was known. Its history as a cinema was short-lived, as it opened in 1911 and closed around 1918. The plaza on the corner of Raleigh Road opened in 1914 and seated 400 people. It closed in 1954 and is now a carpet showroom with a snooker hall above. These cinemas, along with many others, thrived in their time despite their close proximity to each other.
People would queue for hours on end in order to go into the cinema. They had a limited amount of money to spend, and if the ninepenny seats were full and there were seats at a shilling, they wouldn't be able to take those because they only wanted a ninepenny seat, and it was beneath them. If there were seats at sixpence available, they wouldn't take those. A ninepenny seat was what they came for, was what they had in their pockets, and they'd stand out in the rain for hours on end in order to make sure they got in for their ninepence. And it didn't matter what time they went in. It was a continuous performance. The actual number of people that went in at the beginning of the performance and came out at the end of the performance was quite a small percentage. People were coming and going all the time. So you'd go in the middle of the feature film, if you'd like, and you'd just sit all the way around until you came back to the beginning again, the part where you came in. If it was a murder film, you probably knew who the murderer was before you knew who'd been murdered. But that was part of the fun. That was part of it. You'd wait for a double seat if there were two of you. You'd never think of taking two single seats. You'd wait until you wanted exactly what was available for you. And if the queue was a mile long and it was raining, it didn't make any difference.
Local cinemas were often small, but as the boom began, so came the super cinemas. With seating capacity in the thousands and all-round glamour, they made a Saturday night trip into town something special. The first super cinema built in Castle Street was the Regent. It opened in 1928 with seating for 2,050, plus additional standing for 212, and also a cafe for refreshments. It took 2 years to build and had a full orchestra accompanying silent films and a mighty Wurlitzer organ for entertainment in the interval. It went over to talkies in 1929.
The organ I can remember was the Regent in Castle Street, and that used to rise from the floor and to the view of the audience, and the organ would play and entertain the people in the interval.
The Regent, built in Castle Street, was a far cry from the flea pits. However, its situation next to the River Frome wasn't ideal.
But the Regent was flooded on several occasions, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah.
Near the,
That's right.
the river.
Yeah. And they had rats there too.
Did they?
It was on the edge of the water, see?
Yeah, well, it would be. There you are.
But it was a super cinema.
Well, it was arguably the best in Bristol.
Yeah, it was a super cinema.
And don't forget the bike ladies of
Mind you, you've got to remember that later on came the embassy.
1933.
And my pal, who was a chief there,
yeah,
he used to describe it. He said, looking down from the operating box onto the screen,
like a postage stamp.
Like a postage stamp.
The Embassy was the largest cinema in Bristol, with 2,100 seats. It took 1 year to build, and special features included aids for hearing, a massive Art Deco restaurant, and a ballroom. It was an impressive sight with 2,000 coloured lights incorporated into the building.
At the start of the war, September 1939, the government decided that all cinemas should be closed. There was the danger that Germans were going to come over and bomb the big cities, and they didn't want large gatherings of people in any one place. So on the 3rd of September, every cinema had to close. The initial days of the war, nothing happened. Everybody was waiting for something to happen, and nothing very much did happen. And the cinema, of course, was something which was going to keep the morale of people up. There was no other entertainment going on at the time. So it was within a week or perhaps 10 days, the government decided that cinemas should open again on a restricted basis. They could open Mondays to Saturdays, and thus help to keep the morale of the people up. You were given instructions to advise people as soon as the air raid sirens went off, to tell them that a raid was imminent, advise them to leave the cinema, although you would carry on with the programme, and it was up to them as to whether they went out or not. Initially everybody got up and went out, and when they got a bit used to it and found that the bombs weren't falling where they happened to be, they all came back in again, and you would advise them, oh, there's an air raid in progress now, but after a while nobody took much notice of that.
On Sunday the 24th of November 1940, Bristol was blitzed, devastating large areas of the centre. The whole of Castle Street, Bristol's prime shopping centre, was flattened, wiping out the Regent, Bristol's finest cinema. Fortunately, government regulations at that time didn't yet allow for Sunday opening, so there was no audience in the Regent that day. That same raid destroyed other cinemas in and around the city. The Triangle in Clifton, originally a roller skating rink, had opened as a cinema in 1914. A prestigious venue, it attracted prominent Bristol families such as the Frys and the Cadburys. Situated on the corner of the Triangle with an attractive rounded facade, it had a fine orchestra and a cafe which was sited in such a way that patrons could eat, drink and watch films all at the same time. Sadly, the building was gutted by the bombing and was eventually pulled down to make way for shops. On this site was the Portview Picture House, which opened in Avonmouth in 1912. It was another casualty of the 1940 raid. Exactly 1 year later, the Bedminster area came under attack. The imposing Bedminster Hippodrome, also known as the Stole, had 2 enormous side turrets. Originally a music hall, it opened as a cinema in 1915. On the 24th of November 1941, it was flattened. Bedminster was badly hit. The Redcliffe Hall, one of Bristol's worst flea pits, which had opened in 1911, was also destroyed. The Rex in Bedminster had only opened in 1940. Due to war shortages, there wasn't enough steel available, so the balcony wasn't built at that time. After only 4 months of being open, it was hit by a bomb in April 1941, putting it out of action for several months. It reopened the following August, but the balcony wasn't to be completed until 1956, when building materials became available. In nearby Knowle, the Gaiety avoided major damage. An incendiary bomb landed on the corrugated iron roof, where it stuck until it burnt itself out. During the war years, the Gaiety offered the people of Bristol more than just an entertainment venue.
the cinema itself was used, as were a number of other cinemas, as a hostel after the cinema closed at 10:30 or 11 o'clock at night. And people who had been bombed out from their own homes would come in and use it as shelter for the night and stay there.
The Tatler survived attack when Frank Justin stayed on the roof all night with a stirrup pump, dousing sparks as they hit the roof. At the Odeon Broadmead, another hero saved the day. The projectionist Don Cottle climbed onto the roof and put out incendiary bombs. Another bomb in Union Street missed the Odeon, but caused it to close for 3 days when the basement flooded.
During the Second World War, information and propaganda films were rife throughout the cinema industry. They were made quite often in Denham Studios by the Army and the Navy and the RAF film units, and they would put out films such as Miss Smith and Her Cabbage Patch, films like Food Facts, and these would be put out in a manner that would enable people to understand how to live frugally during the Second World War.
The government used the cinemas themselves to convey information. The Ministry of Information used to hold special film shows, and we had something at the Gaiety during the war, to give instruction on food production, food preparation, all sorts of things that you could do, like dig for victory and all sorts of things like that. It was the main way of getting in touch with the public visually. One, of course, listened to the radio and you had all your information and your news from there, but to actually see demonstrations and things, the government used the cinemas, produced their own films, of course. The Ministry of Information produced their own films to be shown.
One of the most popular propaganda films were very early in the war. It was called The German Lambeth Walk. And basically what the editor did was to make the Germans look silly with slow marching, backward marching, and it was so well done, it was continually being shown. This was back in the 1941 period, and the reason for it was, of course, we were having a very, very bad time. But of course, these films continued, and they were very popular. The shortest used to be the food flash. A cymbal crashed, and it lasted for less than half a minute, but it got over what you actually wanted to know, that people should learn about and understand.
Out in the suburbs, the Ambassador at Kingswood, which seated 1,000 people, received a direct hit during a performance. The audience was sheltering under the balcony when the cinema lost its roof. A sales girl was thrown from the auditorium into the foyer with the force of the blast, but amazingly no one was killed. The Gaumont in Baldwin Street was right in the centre of the bombing. On one occasion, a bomb dropped at the rear of the building in Clair Street, and debris fell through the roof during a concert. Although it was surrounded by bomb craters and constantly under attack, it only closed for 2.5 days during the entire war. Its loyal audiences had to pick their way through the debris and war damage to reach the cinema. A night out at the pictures had provided a welcome escape from the grim depression of the war years. By 1945, several venues had disappeared, yet a trip to the pictures was still popular, helping people feel their lives were returning to normal amidst the ruins of the city.
The real charm and attraction of the cinema was the fact that it was taking people out of their ordinary everyday lives into an entirely new, wondrous world. They were called picture palaces, and they were palaces. They were places that were far removed from ordinary life. For many people, the only time they ever walked on carpet in the early days was when they walked on the carpet in the cinema. They had no carpets at home, so that was the luxury itself, and that luxury you could obtain for threepence, sixpence, ninepence, a shilling, and if you were really rich, 1 and threepence. Bargain matinees on Wednesdays and Saturdays at threepence and sixpence, and the other prices during the rest of the week. So it was a small price to pay for real luxury.
Local cinemas had always been keen to promote themselves and the films they were showing. Back in the 20s, the Kings had used a publicity stunt in which a tramp walked from London to Bristol wearing a billboard. Actors and actresses had become film stars, and people chose the films that included their favourites. Over the years, certain famous stars visited Bristol, including Tom Mix, Roy Rogers and Kay Kendall. Cary Grant, the Bristol lad, was always a favourite.
We used to have to try and publicise our films the best that we could. We often tried to publicise them whilst they were still being shown at the Odeon or the ABC, so that people would know that if they waited just a couple more weeks, they could come and see it with us. Some of the more exciting things that we had was when we were showing Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. We actually got the original car to come down and tour around all the South Bristol area and call in at various Fina petrol stations, because we had a big tie-up with Fina Petrol. Amongst the others, we each summer we tried to do a Disney festival. In fact, the Gaiety was the first cinema in the country that ever did a Walt Disney summer festival, and it was taken up by quite a number of other cinemas later on, whereby we showed throughout the whole of the school holidays double features of Disney films only. And we used to get the Disney characters to come down and parade around the local shops and through the Broadwalk shopping precinct, and encourage the crowds to know that during those 6 weeks the Disney characters would be around. One of the other big publicity stunts we had was with the Battle of Britain. A lot of it was filmed with model airplanes, half-size, quarter-size planes. We managed to get hold of some of those and we put them on display in one of the big garages in Bristol. We tied up with the RAF for an exhibition as well. All of it encouraged not only that particular film, but kept the name of your cinema in the public eye and on their lips, so they didn't forget that the Gaiety was around.
By the 1950s, other forms of entertainment were emerging, and many cinema goers had given up their twice-weekly routine visit. To try to counteract the trend, new technologies such as CinemaScope were introduced. Later on, a broader choice of films was offered by dividing the once grand auditoriums into box-like studios.
Back in the early 70s, during the declining years, people used to come to the cinema as a matter of habit on a regular basis, and you'd see the same faces at the same times each week. That core of cinema going stopped, to the extent that cinemas had to think of something drastic to do to get that level of business back, and that's why a lot of cinemas were converted from big single screens into 3, 4, 2 sometimes in smaller cases, so that you could offer product. You'd have 2 or 3 times the audience when playing these films.
The decline was taking hold, and one cinema after another fell victim to demolition.
When I was a young man, they had another cinema at Kings, which was a Regent Cinema then, and a cousin of mine was a projectionist there then. And we used to be able to go to that cinema for tums on a Saturday morning as children, but even when I was an adult, it used to be 9pence in the front seats, and I think a shilling in the back seats, And upstairs in the balcony, it was 1 in 3 and 1 in 6.
The Regent, built in 1912, had been Kingswood's first cinema. The area couldn't sustain the Regent, the nearby Kingsway Cinema and the larger Odeon Cinema just across the road, and so 4 years after the end of the war in 1949, the Regent was closed and later demolished. Its attractive Victorian facade was torn down and the building replaced by modern shops. Alongside their feature film output, most cinema programmes included Pathé newsreels featuring news and current events. Yet by 1953, despite cinema promotions, millions of people sat in the comfort of their own homes to watch the Queen's coronation. Later on, the advent of the commercial channel also significantly boosted the number of television owners. The output of the news theatre was becoming obsolete as more people had access to news on television. Situated at the top of Castle Street, the news theatre had miraculously survived the Blitz, and yet in 1956 became a victim of the planners and was demolished. The Carlton in Westbury-on-Trim had opened in 1933 with 820 seats and a cafe. It closed in 1959 and was demolished to make way for a modern shopping precinct. In 1938, the large Ambassador Cinema was built in the centre of Kingswood, next door to Dr. Grace's surgery. It seated 1,000 and featured stained glass windows commemorating W.G. Grace's cricketing triumphs. It was a comfortable cinema with a very wide auditorium and a balcony. A cafe upstairs offered refreshments.
My wife and I went to the first night of the Ambassador Cinema when it opened up there. It was a premiere of the Jesse Matthews film, and that was the first night of when it was opened there.
The building was a long way back from the road, with a large paved courtyard in front, where patrons queued in orderly rows according to whichever ticket price they required. The cinema was later taken over by the Odeon chain. Unfortunately, its popularity dwindled, and in 1961 it closed and was later reopened as a 10-pin bowling alley. Eventually this also closed and the building was demolished, making way for another shopping precinct. At Filton, the Cabot, which had opened in 1933, was a large imposing cinema situated at the corner of two roads. It went out with a bang in 1961 with a rock and roll show. The building was used as a supermarket for many years. It was later demolished and shops and flats now occupy the site. The Embassy, Clifton's super cinema and the largest in Bristol, finally succumbed to the decline and closed in 1963 to make way for several shops. The Ritz in Bath Road, Brislington, had opened in 1938. A large cinema with 1,400 seats, it was another suburban venue to be closed and demolished in the 1960s. It's now been replaced by a quick-save supermarket. The construction of the old Market Underpass was responsible for wiping out an attractive historic area of Bristol. Casualties of the new road system included two very old Bristol landmarks: the Empire Variety Theatre, which had opened in Carey's Lane in 1893 and was used as a cinema in the 30s, and the Tatler, which had been a cinema between 1910 and 1963. At St George, the Park Cinema closed in 1964. In its battle against dwindling audiences, it had spent £8,000 on cinemascope equipment. It was demolished in 1967, 3 years after its closure, at a cost of £2,500. The original building, in 1911, had only cost £900. Sadly, nothing has replaced the park, and the site still lies empty today. The Gem in Broad Weir operated as a cinema between 1909 and 1932. It was demolished to make way for the Broadmead shopping precinct. In Ashley Down, the Metropole was a cinema from 1913 to 1968. It was filmed here during demolition in August 1989. At the end of the century, Bristol's last independent cinema disappeared from the skyline after a long fight for survival against changing technology and wealthy cinema chains.
I suppose the Gaiety reached its peak of audiences during the 1950s, and when it showed The Sound of Music, it was really at its great height. But gradually, as time went on and the various oppositions that came up to take up people's time and their money and their leisure hours with television and cars and various other things, it was bound to go down. It survived longer than any other independent cinema in Bristol, which I suppose was greatly to the credit of the people that live round about and in outlying districts too, who still managed to support it. And as time went on, of course, by the time the new multiplex cinemas had come along, and the opening of the Showcase cinema in Brislington obviously had a big effect upon it. The age group of people attending the cinema was then, as it always has been, mainly between sort of 16 and 30 years of age. And anything new is going to appeal to that age group, so they obviously went further afield to see their films there. Had it just gone on a little bit longer, it could have survived, but possibly by trying to imitate the others and dividing it into 3 screens, it lost some of its charm.
Sadly, the Gaiety was finally demolished in February 2000.
When the golden age of cinema came to virtually an end, around about the 1960s, you had a lot of people who were not prepared to be without their cinema. And as a result, they built their own, showing full-length feature films, as well as the shorts that I'm interested in. They showed these in sheds, in their attic, and so on. It's surprising how brilliant a cinema can be in miniature. The nearest you get to it today is in Bath, with the Robin. But in point of fact, the latest cinema to be built is in Fishponds, and it's very, very near to the Cross Hands Hotel. And it was built in an attic by a man who changed houses solely because he had the room in which to build his own personal cinema.
Many cinemas in Bristol had been victims of the Blitz, the Decline and the Planners. Audiences were being offered other forms of entertainment, such as bingo and 10-pin bowling. On the whole, the future was looking bleak. Many cinemas which had survived demolition were put to new uses, often still offering entertainment. Cheltenham Road Cinema had opened in 1914. It was later known as the Plaza and the Academy. It eventually closed its doors and was sold in 1956 to the Christadelphians for £7,000 and used as a church. The Kingsway Cinema in Kingswood had cost £9,000 to build in 1928, with seating for 800. It closed in 1959, and the distinctive stone exterior now houses a car showroom. Across the city in Winterstoke Road was the Bedminster Ambassador. Built in 1936, the unusual building housed 1,250 stadium seats, but no balcony. In the late 40s it was taken over by Oscar Deutsch and became the Odeon. In 1961, the cinema was converted into a ballroom and later changed to top ramp bingo. Bingo was eventually replaced in 1995 by a children's indoor play area and a tyre and exhaust centre. The Empress Cinema in Sandy Park Road, Brislington, opened in 1913 with 650 seats. It went on to show films for over 40 years. 6 years after closure as a cinema, it was bought by the Chamberlain family, who ironically used it as a bingo hall. The distinctive building with its fairy tale tower still stands today. St George's Electric Kinema opened in 1911, a small cinema catering for 350 patrons. It could only afford one projector, and so at the end of each 20-minute reel, the audience had to wait patiently for the reel to be changed. John Pugsley enlarged the cinema in 1927, and it was revamped again in 1935 and reopened as the Granada. In the 50s it was updated for widescreen, but in 1961 it fell victim to the bingo craze. It has recently become a Wetherspoons pub, reverting to its earlier name, St George's Hall. The Regal in Staple Hill started life in 1912, shortly after the Fishponds Picture House further down the road. Bill Knight and Wally Ball look back at those days.
I'm sure you remember this as well as I do. Sadly closed as a cinema in 1963.
But in 1927 it was refurbished and the front was altered.
Well, as you can see, it's nicely decorated and virtually unaltered, really, since its heyday, I suppose.
The Regal was another victim of the popularity of television and the craze for bingo. The building has now become the Sanctuary Christian Church. In nearby Fishponds, the Van Dyck Cinema opened in 1926, filling a gap left by the Fishponds Picture House, which had closed 4 years before. It had 742 seats, with 322 in the balcony. In April 1930 it was taken over by the ABC chain for showing film reruns after they had appeared in the Central Cinemas. Like St George's Hall, after its closure in 1973, it was a bingo hall for many years before becoming a Wetherspoons pub in 1997. Although externally it hasn't really changed, inside it has been completely refurbished. The old Rex, which had opened in 1940, was very plain externally. Although a 44-feet CinemaScope screen was installed, it closed in 1980, leaving Bedminster without a cinema. Its huge auditorium is now in use as the last remaining ex-cinema bingo hall in Bristol. The People's Palace in Baldwin Street had converted to a cinema in 1912, having been a live entertainment venue since 1892. It was sold to Gaumont British in 1927 and closed for refurbishment. When it opened the following year as the New Palace, it seated 1,600 people and featured a Christie organ and a cafe. This very popular cinema survived until 1980. One of the attractions of the People's Palace was the showing of locally filmed events by Husbands and Dunscombes. People liked to look out for themselves on screen just as they do today. Housing a nightclub for many years, the Grade 2 listed frontage is protected. And the Christie organ survives at St Francis Church, Ashton.
Now this organ was at the Gaumont Cinema in Borden Street, and in the interval of the films they used to play the organ. When the cinema closed, this organ was transferred to St Francis Church at Ashton.
Out at Keynsham on the outskirts of Bristol, the Charlton Cinema was a popular local venue. It survived until the 1980s when it became a bingo hall. Amidst all these closures, the one positive event was the opening of a new cinema by the ABC chain. The new Bristol Centre in Frogmore Street behind the Hippodrome was the first new cinema to be built in Bristol for 25 years. The spacious 800-seat single-screen cinema featured big family blockbusters which ran for a whole season. The cinema was built as part of an entertainment complex which included an ice skating rink. During quiet parts of the performance, the swish of skates could be heard. The cinema closed in the 90s, and the site has since been redeveloped. In the early 70s, 3 further cinemas appeared on the scene. Studios 1 to 4 at the bottom of the Pithay operated as a cinema between 1973 and 1986. A nightclub now occupies the building. Studios 5, 6 and 7 were built above Waitrose Supermarket on the site of the original Orpheus cinema in Henleaze. The 1,400-seater Orpheus had been built for Mr Pugsley in 1938. In 1971, despite a 500-strong petition, the original building was closed and later demolished. Due to public pressure, a new 3-screen cinema was opened in 1973 called Studios 5, 6 and 7. It was closed by Canon when the new showcase opened at St Philip's, but reopened by Picturedrome Cinemas in June 1995, under its original name, the Orpheus. With the 70s came a new wave of cinemas catering for alternative markets. The Europa opened next to the Holiday Inn in Old Market in 1974. It was a 2-screen cinema showing adult movies and filled a gap left by the closure of the Tatler in 1963.
Amongst the independent circuits, you also had the specialist cinemas, the ones which would be called the arts. You had the Arnolfini to a certain extent, the Watershed virtually took over, and then of course you had the Arts Cinema, which became the Cube Cinema, and it's one to which you have to be a member. It's an interesting one where they show rare, unusual films, and it would be filled full of students. It was geared to a certain element of the population who liked to see, shall we say, avant-garde films.
Despite all the closures, the city today still has a wide variety of cinemas. The Arts Centre, Arnolfini and Watershed still cater for the specialist markets. At Henley's, the Orpheus has survived name changes, closures and even demolition and rebuilding. It still attracts a loyal audience. Built in 1939 on the site of the old Fry's chocolate factory, the Odeon in Broadmead was one of Bristol's most luxurious picture palaces. In the entrance there was a mosaic floor, marble pillars and fabulous lighting. It seated 1,000 in the stalls, a further 900 upstairs, and a cafe offered refreshments.
The Odeon with the lovely green and cream tiles.
The Odeon, the inside of it, it was like going into just a small entrance, but you went in and then there was
It was octagonal
It was a
shape.
palace, you know.
Yeah.
It was refurbished in 1967 and a new screen was installed. The cinema survived the decline by converting into 3 smaller screens in 1974. In 1983, its original entrance was sold to Mothercare. It reopened in 1985 with a new entrance in Union Street. The imposing Odeon building hides a gruesome tale in its past. During a performance of The Light That Faded, the manager, Mr. Partington Jackson, was found shot in the head. At the time, both the murderer and the motive remained a mystery. The Odeon survives today by offering very competitive ticket prices.
You've got a nice atmosphere. You've got a character there. If you go to the White Lilies and the Odeon and the Orpheus, it's what I call a sense of occasion, and it's a proper night out.
The oldest working cinema in Bristol is the White Ladies in Clifton. The origins of the building are uncertain, but it was probably once a nunnery, hence the unusual name White Ladies. When it was converted to a cinema with 1,320 seats, the facade was changed and a tower erected. The Duchess of Beaufort performed the opening ceremony in 1921. In 1978, following the popular trend, it was converted to 3 screens, with a cafe and a ballroom attached. Although it survived for a further 20 years, in 1999 its future was in doubt.
Barry Jenkins of ABC, he's the chairman of course, had an offer of £1 million which they couldn't refuse. When news was released of the proposed sale of the cinema, it caused a public outcry, and I was privileged to lead the campaign against closure of the White Ladies. The university students and many people wrote to the Evening Post, and as a matter of fact, and because of that, Barry Jenkins had second thoughts, and happily the White Lilies are still thriving.
Certain cinemas have a different niche, traditional cinemas like ourselves, and certainly in this area in Bristol, cater for students and probably more middle class, middle age from the Clifton region of Bristol. The reason in my mind that cinemas have survived is probably due to the car. Certainly with multiplex developments you have to have a car to visit those. It's not something that affects us quite so much.
Although they've modernised the foyer, obviously the pillars are still there, the mosaic floor is still there, and the ornate ceiling is still there, albeit covered up. But the ornate plasterwork, the barrel vaulted ceiling in the old circle, thankfully is still there, and most of the ornamentation in the screen 2 and 3 in the former stalls area is still there. So that more or less is what I would say a proper cinema.
In August 1994, the first of the huge multiplex cinemas came to Bristol. In stark contrast to our traditional venues, the showcase at St Philip's, with 14 screens and a total of 3,600 seats, offers the kind of choice expected by the modern cinema goer. The cinema forms part of an entertainment complex, nicknamed Little America. Huge parking facilities are shared with a nearby bowling alley, restaurant and shops. Multiplexes offer a cinema programme to cater for a variety of tastes and age groups. In the wake of the popularity of the showcase, a second multiplex opened at Hengrove Leisure Park. Within its plain exterior, Cineworld offers an impressive 14 screens. A large free car park makes it attractive to motorists. Nestling within a vibrant community of entertainment outlets at Cribbs Causeway is the 12-screen Warner Village Multiplex Cinema. Surrounded by thriving restaurants, bars and a games centre, its modern, eye-catching exterior is hard to miss. Following the success of the Cribbs Causeway venue, a second Warner Village opened across the city at Longwell Green in 1999.
We opened in November 1999 with James Bond, The World Is Not Enough. We've got 13 screens. Every screen has got luxury seats, or we call them love seats. They're very comfortable, lots of leg room. You can be 6'4" and still be able to stretch your legs out no matter where you sit. Also, we've got stadium seats in every screen, which means that even the smallest child pretty much can see what's going on the screen, even if they've got someone quite tall sitting in front of them.
Behind the scenes, the job of the projectionist has changed dramatically over the years.
When I first started in the business, we just had one speaker behind the screen, which just gave us basic mono sound. Over the years, things have progressed up to stereo sound, starting with, in 1977, the first Star Wars movie where Dolby got involved. Today, we're up to now fully digital sound. Here in the projection booth in Longwell Green, all 13 projectors are computer controlled and can be operated by one person. The projector status monitor that we have is a system where we have 13 icons. If the icon is red, then the projector needs to be laced up. If it's in yellow, it's laced up and ready to go. And if it's green, it means the film is running. The non-rewind system enables the operator to lace up the projector. The film is always coming from the centre and back into the centre when it goes onto the other plate. So after a show, it doesn't need to be rewound.
The latest cinema to arrive in Bristol is the Imax, which opened on the 20th of April 2000, the first in the southwest and only the fourth in the country. Imax specialises in exploring the hidden secrets of natural wonders. The most advanced and powerful projectors in the world ensure crystal clear 3D pictures on a huge screen, complemented by surround sound to give the impression that the viewer is taking part in the action. We've come a long way from those early beginnings of the first flickering images at the start of the century. A night out at the pictures seems to belong to a previous era. So what is the fascination still, and what does the future hold?
Cinema has definitely become more popular over the last decade because of the better product coming from Hollywood and the revival of the British film industry with the likes of Four Weddings and a Funeral and Notting Hill, Trainspotting. And I think that the advertising and marketing of films is a lot more in your face, and people are generally a lot more aware of what films are coming out. And I think they just enjoy going to the cinema as a family or as a couple or with their friends on a regular basis, probably once a week for a lot of people now.
Of course, the cinema went through a very bad patch, and perhaps 5-6 years ago we dropped right down to overall quite an alarming low rate of people attending, and it's gradually come up. The advent of the multiplex cinemas, which have caught the imagination of the public in order to go into a cinema where they have a choice of 10, 12, 14 different screens that they can attend, has brought the popularity back.
Certainly the multiplex developments across the country have given us a very solid basis for the future, and I think cinema will be here for a long time.
We will build probably a few big event cinemas, sort of 30-screen megaplexes, but I think generally on the whole, wherever you're living in the country, you'll be able to find a multiplex cinema within easy reach.
I think that the future holds very well for cinema. It's an out-of-the-home experience, which is the important thing. One can sit at home and watch a television film. It is never the same as participating in an uninterrupted viewing of a film where you know the telephone isn't going to ring or somebody isn't going to call and interrupt you. You can sit there, you're completely and utterly relaxed in a very high standard of comfort, very comfortable seating, and sit back and enjoy your popcorn, and I can't think that anything is going to change that.